Black Meridian, Piracy and Empire. Where empire meets outlaw in the Golden Age of Piracy, history is written in blood and salt. By Sean Patrick Sayers. Copyright 2025, all rights reserved. Contact at seanpatricksayers.com.
No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, or otherwise, without the prior written permission of the publisher, except in the case of brief quotations embodied in critical articles or reviews.
See him now, a lean young man with the salt in his hair and the promise of violence about him. Henry Morgan was born to the green hills and damp earth of Wales, son of a modest farmer, but the fates carried him far from those gentle fields. While still little more than a boy, he was stolen away to the New World, shanghaied on a Bristol dock, and packed into the foul hold of a westbound ship. In Barbados, he was sold to labor as an indentured servant under a pitiless sun. There, among the cane and lash, he learned how cheaply a life might be held, and in that cruel school, something brutal took root in him. When Morgan finally shed his servitude, he did not return to Wales. Instead, he gazed westward, where beyond the horizon lay Spanish cities fat with gold, and Morgan swore that never again would he wear any man's yoke. Morgan surfaced in Jamaica, a wild harbor of broken men and cutthroats, and he found his calling there. Port Royal was then just a sun-scorched strip of land lined with taverns and brothels, where the air reeked of rum and gunpowder. Here, the exiled and the ambitious gathered under the black flag of buccaneers, those sea raiders who pillaged Spain's empire with the unspoken blessing of the English crown. Morgan joined their ranks as a privateer, quick to learn the cruel arts of war. In the firelight of coastal encampments, Morgan listened to the veterans' tales of sacked cities and seized treasure galleons, and he felt that old hunger stir anew. He was not a deckhand for long. Morgan rose by cunning and daring, proving himself in boarding actions against Spanish ships and raids on small ports. Soon enough, he commanded a ship, and hard men were ready to follow him for a share of whatever prize he sought. Morgan's star was ascending, and with each skirmish and stolen cargo, his name gained legitimacy. In 1667, Morgan launched his first major assault. Leading a ragtag fleet of freebooters, he struck the sleepy Spanish town of Puerto Príncipe on Cuba's coast. The raiders swept through with pistols drawn and cutlasses flashing, and by the time the smoke had lifted, the merchants' coffers lay bare, stripped of their silver. It was a modest haul, a mere glimpse of the riches to come, but it stirred something in Morgan, igniting a hunger that would soon outrun caution. Why nibble at crumbs when the Spaniard gorged himself on whole cities? There were rumors whispered in Jamaican taverns of a place where the riches of Peru passed through on their way to Spain's treasury. Portobello, a jewel on the Spanish main guarded by imposing forts and deadly cannons. That would be his next target. And if it seemed mad to assault such a stronghold with a few hundred men, so much the better. For boldness and surprise were weapons he knew well how to wield. And so, in the summer of 1668, Captain Morgan gathered a lean and hungry crew of buccaneers and set sail for Portobello. Under cover of darkness, they anchored on a mosquito coast 20 miles from the city and slipped ashore. Morgan led 400 men through swamps and jungle to approach the town from its landward side, where no enemy was expected. In the dead of night, they moved like wraiths among the trees, and before dawn, the first Spanish sentries were killed with knives across their throats. A cry went up as the sun's edge broke over the Caribbean and the buccaneers stormed the outer fort. The Spaniards, roused from sleep, stumbled out to a fury of musket fire and cutlasses flashing in the new light. Morgan's men fought with a savage will, climbing the ramparts, shooting and slashing at any who stood against them. Within an hour, the first fortress fell. The surviving defenders threw down their arms or lay dead in pools of their own blood. Morgan ordered the Spanish cannons turned on the town and the forts. A huge explosion shook the earth as the fort's powder magazine was touched off. Flames and black smoke billowed upward, and the very stones of Portobello trembled. With this thunderous dawn greeting, the pirates pressed their attack into the heart of the city. Yet one stronghold still held out. The second fort, commanding the harbor, where a committed Spanish commander had barricaded himself with his soldiers. They poured musket balls and cannon shot from behind thick stone walls at the approaching pirates. Morgan rallied his men for an assault. They scavenged timbers and rope, fashioning makeshift ladders to scale the ramparts. So fierce was the fire from the fort that only the insane wished to be first over those walls. With cold ingenuity, Morgan forced a gaggle of captured friars and nuns to march in front of his vanguard, laden with the ladders. The Spanish hesitated to fire on their own clergy, and in that moment of hesitation, the buccaneers surged forward and raised the ladders against the walls. What followed was a bloody melee at the parapet. Driven by despair and honor, Spanish defenders met the invaders with pike and blade. The fort's commander shot any man who turned to run and fought with ferocity, even as his men fell around him. Morgan's pirates were hit with grape shot and musket fire at point-blank range. Many dropped from the ladders into the ditch, broken and bloody. But sheer savage momentum carried the day. Howling Englishmen and Frenchmen clambered over the wall and pushed through the fort, shooting down the gunners and blasting open doors with grenades. The Spanish commander refused to yield. Cornered, he emptied his pistols and swung his sword until a dozen wounds finally cut him down. By midday, the last fort had fallen, its bloodied flag hauled down, and the smoke cleared to reveal Morgan's men triumphant and murder-stained amid the carnage. Portobello was in Morgan's hands. What followed was an orgy of plunder and terror. His men swarmed through the town like a plague of locusts. Churches and storehouses were ransacked for gold and silver. Villas of the wealthy were stripped of every jeweled crucifix and candlestick, and those citizens who tried to hide their riches were swiftly and viciously persuaded to part with them. Screams echoed in the narrow streets as pirates tortured merchants over smoldering coals and drove steel spikes under fingernails to force them to reveal secret hoards. The conquistadors of Spain had once treated these lands with similar cruelty, and now that brutality was visited upon their heirs tenfold. When the pillage was complete, Morgan sent a messenger to the Spanish governor of Panama, demanding a king's ransom to spare what remained of Portobello. With the letter, he sent a fine pistol as a taunt, inviting the governor to keep the weapon for 1 year, after which Morgan vowed he would return to reclaim it in person. The governor's reply was all scorn, addressing Morgan not as a duly commissioned officer of England, but as a common pirate and a bandit. He promised nothing but death if Morgan dared set foot near Panama. Morgan read the answer impassively. Then he gave the order to put Portobello to the torch. Weighted with Spanish gold and glory, Morgan sailed back to Port Royal. Throughout the Caribbean, his name was spoken with awe, for Portobello's fate had proven that no Spanish bastion was beyond the reach of his ruthless daring. His men drank and gambled away their shares in the grog shops of Jamaica, and when Morgan next called for volunteers, they came gladly, drawn by the promise of plunder. By early 1669, he had assembled another fleet, and this time he steered south toward the Spanish Main itself, to the Gulf of Maracaibo on the coast of Venezuela. 2 Spanish towns lay there, Maracaibo on the lake's edge and Gibraltar further inland, ripe for the taking. Morgan's ships slipped past the harbor batteries at the lake's entrance under cover of darkness, and the buccaneers descended like wolves upon those settlements. Maracaibo fell with hardly a struggle, its people having fled, and Gibraltar was soon conquered after a brief battle in the streets. For weeks the pirates held sway over the region, extorting ransoms from wealthy citizens and torturing those who hid their valuables. Although Maracaibo's spoils did not equal Portobello's treasure, Morgan's audacity had made him a legend. But Spanish pride would not suffer such insults without a reply. As Morgan prepared to sail out from the lake with his flotilla of ships laden with loot, he found the way barred by a Spanish squadron sent to trap him. 3 Spanish warships, laden with guns and commanded by a proud admiral, lay at the narrow outlet of Lake Maracaibo. They had the advantage in firepower and held the pirates penned in, with the guns of a fortress on shore to aid them. Morgan faced a grim predicament, his men laden with gold, but with no clear path to the open sea. Surrender was not an option he would entertain. Instead, he turned once more to trickery and audacity. He had one of his lesser vessels stripped to the beams and refitted as a decoy hellship. Wooden logs were dressed in cloth to mimic cannons. Scarecrow figures were propped along the rails as false crew, and the ship's hull was filled with pitch, tar, and powder. At first light, Morgan sent this fire ship drifting toward the Spanish flagship. The Spaniards watched it approach, thinking it merely a merchant prize the pirates meant to sacrifice in desperation. Only when it was nearly upon them did they see the fuse set sputtering along its deck. Too late did the admiral cry for his gunners to sink it. Flames engulfed the Spanish flagship with a roar, and its great hull burst asunder, scattering men and iron into the sky. Amid the chaos, Morgan's other ships surged forward. His men grappled a second Spanish warship and clambered aboard with swords and pistols, sweeping the decks clear in minutes. The third Spanish vessel turned to flee, its captain choosing to scuttle his ship in the shoals rather than let it fall to the pirates. On shore, the fortress garrison looked on in shock as their fleet was undone by Morgan's cunning. Those soldiers surrendered before the sun was high, and the way to the sea lay open. Morgan sailed out of Maracaibo triumphant, his holds bursting with plunder, and his reputation as the scourge of the Spaniards cemented beyond doubt. But even legends can know uneasy times. Not long after Morgan's triumph at Maracaibo, England and Spain made an abrupt peace. The buccaneers' letters of marque were revoked, and Morgan found himself a rogue without a war. For a while he settled onto his Jamaican plantation, a newly wealthy man trying to play the part of a country gentleman. Yet the Spanish did not cease their reprisals. Enraged from their losses, they licensed their corsairs to harass English ships and settlements in the Caribbean. Before long, news reached Jamaica of Spanish raiders burning plantations and sinking merchant sloops. The fragile peace was peace in name only. Morgan, restless and thirsty for action, saw that his talents were needed again. Officially, the colonial governors could not sanction a new privateering venture, but in back rooms and smoky taverns, the call went out for Captain Morgan to rally the brethren of the coast once more. If Spain would not honor the truce in these waters, then neither would he. His eyes turned to Panama, the very prize he had taunted, and the Spaniards had thought safe behind jungled walls. It was an audacious target, nothing less than the greatest Spanish city in the New World after Lima and Mexico. Panama lay on the Pacific side of the isthmus, a place no buccaneer could reach by ship alone. To sack it, an army would have to cross the mountainous rainforest and brave the pestilential swamps of the interior. Such a thing had never been tried, but Morgan's mind was fixed. In late 1670, he convened a grand council of privateer captains and rogues from across the West Indies. They met on the island of Tortuga off Hispaniola, and there, under a blood-red flag, Morgan proposed the bold strike. Perhaps some thought him mad, but the gleam of Panama's rumored wealth silenced doubts. They drew up articles of agreement for the venture. Every man would have an equal share in the plunder, with generous bounties for officers and compensation for the maimed. Nearly 2,000 fighting men swarmed to Morgan's banner. By Christmas of 1670, this fierce armada set sail for the Spanish Main, the decks crowded with armed men eager for riches or death. On their way to Panama, Morgan's force captured the islands of Old Providence and Santa Catalina off the Mosquito Coast, using them as a forward base. The Spanish garrison on Santa Catalina surrendered with suspicious haste. The fall of that island yielded Morgan not only a secure harbor, but also a trove of supplies and gunpowder, and even a few Spanish guides familiar with the trails across the isthmus. Provisioned and apprised of the terrain ahead, Morgan pressed onward. In early January of 1671, his fleet appeared at the mouth of the Chagres River on Panama's Caribbean coast. There stood the formidable stone bastion of San Lorenzo, guarding the river's entrance, the last outpost of Spanish power before the jungle expanse beyond. Morgan needed that fort to secure his line of retreat. He dispatched several hundred men by ship to storm San Lorenzo, while the main body of buccaneers waited just out of sight along the coast. The assault on San Lorenzo proved a bloody affair. The Spanish defenders, forewarned of Morgan's coming, had strengthened the fort's walls and doubled its garrison. As the pirate vanguard landed and charged up the rocky slopes, they met with withering volleys of musketry and cannon grapeshot. Men fell by the dozens on the open approach, the screams of the wounded mingling with the thunder of guns. The first attack was hurled back, and a second charge at dusk fared little better. Pirates clambered up the ravine only to be cut down, their bodies tumbling back in the flicker of musket flashes. After hours of fierce fighting, the buccaneers were on the brink of despair. Then, an uncanny turn of fate tipped the balance. Amid the smoke and dark, a pirate enraged after taking an arrow in the shoulder from an Indian archer on the ramparts yanked the shaft from his flesh. He wrapped its head in oiled cotton, lit it from a fallen torch, and shot it back from his musket over the fort wall. A moment later, a blast broke the night as San Lorenzo's powder magazine erupted in flame. The explosion shattered a wall section, blasting defenders into the air and sowing chaos within. Seizing the moment, the attackers surged forward one final time. They swarmed through the breach, pistols firing and cutlasses swinging. By midnight, the proud fortress had fallen. Piles of Spanish dead littered the courtyard, and fires licked at shattered ramparts. Nearly 100 of Morgan's men lay among the slain, and many more were wounded, including the brave Captain Bradley, who had led the assault and was mortally hurt in the final rush. 4 days later, Morgan arrived at San Lorenzo to find the English flag flying over its blackened walls. He walked the scorched grounds and counted the cost in lives, his jaw set tight. There was no turning back now. Leaving 500 men to hold the ruined fort and guard their rear, Morgan led the remaining force, some 1,200 pirates, into the depths of the Panamanian wilderness. The march across the isthmus began in earnest. The pirates dragged themselves upstream in canoes and longboats as far as the Chagres River was navigable, then disembarked into the steaming jungle. They hacked their way along narrow trails under a canopy of gigantic trees that blotted out the sun. Soon, the true enemy became not the Spaniards, but the land itself. The air was thick with insects that bit and stung. Great ceiba trees loomed in ghostly silence draped in moss, and now and again the solitude was broken by the scream of a distant jaguar or the bellow of unseen howler monkeys. Spanish scouts shadowed the column, and the invaders caught glimpses of them slipping through the foliage like spirits, but the enemy never massed to attack. Instead, the Spanish had stripped every village along the route of food and burned whatever they could not carry, leaving only smoldering ruins and poisoned wells. After a few days, Morgan's men had eaten through the scant provisions they brought. Hunger set upon them like a gaunt hound. They chewed leather straps and leaves, anything to fill their bellies. Men weakened and tempers frayed. A few collapsed by the wayside and could go no further. Others, eyes sunken and desperate, muttered that they should turn back before they all perished in these green hells. Morgan silenced such talk with a flinty glare and a hand resting on his pistol. He knew there was no salvation behind them, only an empty-handed retreat through the same starvation. Forward lay their one hope, and he drove them on like a man possessed. Day after day, they trudged, drenched by tropical rains that came like clockwork each afternoon, leaving them shivering at night. Still, Morgan pushed them deeper into that haunted wilderness, westward toward Panama. On the 9th day of the march, as their strength was nearly spent, Providence finally smiled. A small party of scouts stumbled upon a herd of cattle and a few horses grazing in a hidden vale, stragglers the Spanish had missed in their retreat. With cries of joy, the buccaneers fell upon the beasts. Shots rang out, and arrows flew as starving men brought down the animals and butchered them on the spot. Many could not wait for the meat to cook. They devoured it half-charred and dripping with blood. That night, Morgan's army dined well for the first time in over a week. Bellies full of beef and hearts rekindled with hope, they pressed on with renewed vigor the following day. The jungle began to thin, and the ground rose beneath their feet. By midday, the column emerged onto a rocky height, and there before them lay the great South Sea, the Pacific Ocean, gleaming blue to the horizon. At its edge sprawled the city of Panama, a spread of white walls and red-tiled roofs basking in the tropical sun. Beyond the city's ramparts in the bay rode Spanish galleons at anchor, and Morgan could just make out smaller vessels already fleeing westward, laden with whatever treasures could be saved. His men gave a ragged cheer at the sight of their long-sought prize. Morgan allowed himself a thin, wolfish grin. 2 years ago, he dared the Spaniards to defend this gilded city, and now he had arrived to make good on that threat. He led his force out of the hills toward Panama with flying banners and drums pounding through the day's heat. Panama's governor, Don Juan Pérez de Guzmán, had marshaled a formidable defense outside the city. On the morning of January 18, 1671, Morgan's buccaneers found an army arrayed against them on the savanna known as Mata Asnilos, a motley Spanish host of militia, native auxiliaries, and slaves totaling nearly 3,600, with lancers on horseback and ranks of musketeers glinting in the sun. They outnumbered Morgan's force 3-1, yet most were inexperienced in war, while Morgan's cutthroats were seasoned killers many times over. Morgan made the first move as the two forces eyed each other across the plain. He spotted a small hill on the flank and sent a company of sharpshooters to seize it. These crack shots, many of them French buccaneers skilled in hunting, took position and leveled their long muskets. The Spanish governor, hoping to crush the invaders quickly, ordered his cavalry to charge. A trumpet blared, and 400 horsemen thundered forward, swords flashing, but the ground beneath them was soft and boggy, and their charge soon faltered into confusion. At that moment, the buccaneer marksmen opened fire from the hill. Their bullets brought down officers and horses alike with deadly precision. Riderless steeds careened through the ranks, and wounded men cried out in panic. The Spanish cavalry, bleeding and disordered, wheeled back in retreat. Next, the Spaniards tried a desperate ploy. They drove a herd of wild bulls and cattle toward the pirate lines, hoping to stampede the buccaneers. The plain shook with the clamor of hooves as the beasts came on in a dust cloud. But the gunfire and the din of battle only terrified the herd. Most of the crazed animals veered away, scattering into the jungles on either side. A few barreled onward into the pirates, only to be calmly shot down and promptly butchered by laughing rogues who had not eaten fresh meat in days. So much for the Spanish stratagem. They had unwittingly delivered a feast to men who fought half-starved. With the failure of their cavalry and the cattle, the Spaniards began to falter. Their infantry had held back a line of 1,200 musketeers, who now loosed a ragged volley at the buccaneers from behind a scrubby rise. A few pirates fell dead, but Morgan's bloodied host answered with a fierce charge. Screaming oaths, the privateers surged forward across the corpse-strewn field. At this onslaught, the resolve of the Spanish militia shattered. They broke and ran even before the buccaneers reached them, casting aside their muskets as they fled headlong toward the city gates. Morgan's men gave chase, cutting down stragglers without mercy. Panama's grand army had been scattered to the winds in scarcely 2 hours of combat. The plain was littered with the bodies of Spanish soldiers and the carcasses of horses and oxen, a gruesome toll steaming under the late morning sun. Several hundred Spaniards had been slain or wounded against only a handful of pirate dead. Not since Cortés met the Aztecs had the New World seen such a one-sided battle. Morgan surveyed the carnage with cold satisfaction. His men rounded up the few prisoners taken, and under threat of drawn blades, forced them to divulge what awaited in the city. Though defeated in the field, the Spaniards still had some 2,000 armed men behind Panama's walls, and they had dug trenches and emplaced cannons to defend every street. Morgan's jaw tightened at the news. He knew the day's bloody work was far from over. He rallied his buccaneers for the final assault. Powder-blackened and sweat-drenched, their ranks formed up and advanced toward the city. Panama's last hours of freedom were at hand. Once the pride of Spain's empire on the southern sea, Panama City met its day of reckoning that afternoon. Morgan's men breached the outer defenses and poured into the streets, where desperate blockades of wagons and barrels had been thrown up. Spanish soldiers and armed citizens alike fought from windows and rooftops, volleying musket fire and rolling barrels of gunpowder lit as improvised bombs. The buccaneers answered with deadly marksmanship and savage ferocity. They flushed defenders out of every cover with grenades and musket shot, then fell upon them with cutlass and dagger. The clash raged from plaza to plaza. Cannon thundered from street corners, shattering adobe walls and sending rooftop tiles crashing down. Women and children ran screaming through the smoke-filled alleyways. By twilight, the city's resistance crumbled. Groups of Spanish defenders threw down their arms and scattered, some fleeing into the surrounding hills. others barricading themselves in convents or churches in hopes of mercy. Flames had begun to lick at the city's edges, whether set by the Spaniards as a scorched earth ploy or by drunken pirates with torches, no one could say. Panama glowed an eerie red as night fell, with countless fires painting the sky. The din of battle gave way to the wails of survivors and the bellowing of cattle and mules caught in the conflagration. Morgan walked slowly through the conquered city as ash drifted as gray snow. His boots crushed fallen Spanish flags into the mud. Panama was his, and he beheld it as a man might regard a vanquished kingdom without joy and without pity. For the next several weeks, chaos reigned. The buccaneers hunted down anyone who had fled with valuables, combing the hills and villages around Panama for buried treasure chests and hastily hidden riches. Spanish gold and silver that had been accumulated over decades now changed hands in mere hours, pried from hiding places under floorboards or behind church altars. Morgan imposed a brutal order to the looting, forbidding his drunken crew from guzzling captured wine by claiming it was poisoned. He knew well that a drunken pirate army could quickly turn into a rabble easy for the still numerous Spaniards to retaliate against. When some of his men grew unruly or too debauched, Morgan dealt out summary hangings to restore discipline. Systematically, they divided the city into sectors to pillage. Every house was ransacked from cellar to rafters, and every convent and warehouse emptied of goods. Mountains of coins, bullion, and gems were piled up in the courtyard of the cathedral, guarded by Morgan's most trusted lieutenants. Priceless silks were trampled underfoot, casks of rare wine smashed open in the streets. The privateers also rounded up hundreds of captives, men, women, and children of Panama, whom they locked in churches or corrals and held for ransom. Many prisoners were tortured for information and made to scream out the whereabouts of hidden caches of wealth. Such was the terror that stalked Panama's ruins. At last, when nothing was left to seize or destroy, Morgan prepared to depart the shattered city. By late February, what loot could be carried had been gathered up, so much that it required an estimated 175 pack mules to bear it. The rest had melted into the flames or been spirited away by those few Spaniards who escaped. Morgan's army began its long trek back to the Caribbean coast, driving along a miserable train of prisoners in chains and enslaved Africans taken from Panama's households. They cut a grim procession through the blackened ruins of the once great city, leaving behind charred rubble and unburied corpses on which carrion birds now pecked. Not wishing to linger a moment longer in that cursed place, Morgan pushed the march hard. Partway through the journey, he halted to take an extraordinary precaution. He ordered every member of his army, himself included, to be searched from head to toe to ensure no man had hidden away any stray gem or coin for himself. All plunder was to remain in the common treasury until division. Such was Morgan's iron discipline, and his mistrust of even his own cutthroats when it came to greed. When the pirates finally reached San Lorenzo and the mouth of the Chagres, they found their ships still riding at anchor on the river's brown tide. The sight of those vessels lifted their spirits, for it meant a swift return to Port Royal's pleasures was near. Morgan, however, had one more treacherous act to perform. He attempted to wring a ransom from the Spanish for the return of Fort San Lorenzo itself, but none was forthcoming. So he coolly ordered the stout fortress blown up and the town at its base burned to ash. While his men busied themselves with this destruction, Morgan quietly loaded the bulk of Panama's treasure onto his flagship. In the dead of night, he set sail for Jamaica, abandoning most of his followers on that lonely shore with only a pittance of the spoils. When the buccaneers realized their leader had absconded with the lion's share, Morgan was long gone on the open sea. Those he left behind cursed his name, but their oaths were empty in the face of what awaited. Spanish vengeance soon swept over the area. Bands of Spanish soldiers hunted down many of the stragglers and butchered them without mercy. A few of the hardiest managed to slip away into the wilds, and fewer still reached safe havens like Tortuga to tell the tale of Panama's fall. In April of 1671, Sir Henry Morgan, who would soon claim that title, stepped off his ship in Jamaica to a hero's welcome. His men once again filled the whorehouses and taverns of Port Royal. Morgan used his healthy share of the Panama spoils to buy even more land. He was now a wealthy landowner in Jamaica. But politics shifted like Caribbean weather. Word of the Treaty of Madrid had reached the Americas. England and Spain were officially at peace, and London could not openly condone Morgan's actions. The governor who had covertly backed Morgan was arrested and sent to England in chains, and not long after, Morgan also received a summons. He sailed for London under a cloud of uncertainty, ostensibly to face charges for exceeding his commission. Yet when he arrived, he was not thrown in a dungeon, but welcomed at court as a hero. The audacious sack of Panama had captured the public's imagination. In 1674, Morgan was rewarded with a knighthood for services to crown and country, an irony as deep as the sea, for no king's soldier had ever committed deeds as Morgan had. Sir Henry Morgan returned to Jamaica not as a prisoner, but as its lieutenant governor, now charged with keeping the peace he had spent his life defying. The last chapters of Morgan's life passed in a strange twilight of respectability. Dressed in satin and lace, he presided over councils in Kingston and dined with the very planters whose fields he once protected by terrorizing their enemies. He took up the task of hunting down pirates who refused to heed the new laws, many of them former comrades who had once fought at his side. In his cups, Sir Henry would brag of his exploits, describing with a nostalgic glint the sack of Portobello or the battle on the Savannah outside Panama. Some say that as he aged and the rum soaked deeper into his liver, he was haunted by specters of the countless dead left in his wake. Others say he never lost a wink of sleep. In 1688, nature finally accomplished what Spanish steel and shot could not. Henry Morgan died peacefully in his bed, bloated by drink and illness, a man of 53. He was given a splendid funeral in Jamaica, buried as befit a noble gentleman. Cannons boomed in salute over Port Royal Harbor, and the flags of England fluttered at half-mast. Thus passed one of history's most paradoxical figures, a man of ruthless bloodshed and boundless greed who died wealthy, honored, and seemingly unrepentant. Yet the ruins of old Panama and the ghosts of its slain still remain under the strangling vines and moonlight, as if the land itself remembers the blood spilled there.